As I mentioned last time, we're gearing up for a brand new fellowship-wide season over at the Mythic Mind Fellowship, focused on exploring the psyche. And so what this means is we'll have a new podcast series that explores various aspects of the human mind and the life of the mind. We're also going to have a course on Kierkegaard's approach to anxiety and despair and the integrated human self. We have a related series on the Mythic Mind Movies podcast, related series on the Mythic Mind Games podcast. So all this together is going to be focused in on exploring the psyche. Now, as we work on getting all this together, we're taking things a little bit more slowly in August. And so I'm going to provide you today with another reading from the Inkwell. And these Inkwell readings are readings of the articles that are written for the Mythic Mind Fellowship. And this is typically going to be an exclusive podcast feed for members of the Mythic Mind Fellowship at the Fellow or Companions tier of membership. And so if you'd like access to that, then head over to mythicmindfellowship.com and become a member as a fellow or as a companion. Or if you don't want to sign on as a paying member right now, then make sure you at least sign on as a free member to keep up to date with all the various things that we are doing. And so again, that is mythicmindfellowship.com. But for now, let's get to our next reading from the Inkwell. Welcome to the Inkwell, the member-exclusive podcast where we read articles written for Mythic Mind by Andrew Snyder and other members of the Fellowship. We hope you enjoy. A review of the BBC's That Hideous Strength by Andrew Snyder. The BBC recently put out an audio drama adaptation of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. This is one of my favorite books, and so I was naturally excited about the prospects here. I wanted for this to succeed. With that being said, I definitely had a degree of skepticism going into this, as the profoundly anti-modern philosophy of Lewis's dystopian fairy tale is hardly what I would associate with a major media institution such as the British Broadcasting Network. After all, England unironically has its own NICE, that is, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Not exactly the same thing as Lewis's NICE, but it is an interesting overlap of fiction and fact here. And in the end, it turns out that my skeptical impulses were correct. The celestial wisdom of Lewis was lost to the forces of this silent planet. Oh, and in case it needs to be said, I will be discussing major spoilers, both regarding the book as well as this adaptation. Now, to be fair, it's impossible for anyone to condense a tome like That Hideous Strength into a 2-hour adaptation without cutting out a considerable amount of content. Now, this could raise the question as to whether it should have been condensed to 2 hours, but I'll accept this limitation for the time being. With that in mind, the pacing is decent, even if it misses some of the meandering feel that's actually significant to the story. Also, I enjoyed the music transitions. I thought they did pretty well in kind of capturing the spirit of the age. But beyond that, there's really not a whole lot left for me to praise. First, let's consider what That Hideous Strength is so we can evaluate what it's for and where exactly the adaptation misses the mark, pun intended. In his prologue to That Hideous Strength, Lewis explicitly states that this is a fairy tale primarily meant to illustrate his arguments in the abolition of man. In other words, this is not a story that happens to have some points for philosophical reflection. This is a philosophical story that, apart from that philosophy, is not that story. Furthermore, this novel is inseparable from the dialectic established by the previous 2 books in the series. Sometimes people say that That Hideous Strength can be read in isolation, but I really disagree with this. Sure, the basic plot can be followed by itself, but the essence of the story is tied to the broader meta-narrative, which frames the story as a philosophical and an archetypal tale. In what follows, I'm going to be discussing a few major ways that the adaptation just utterly hollows out this story. Going back to the first book in the series, in Out of the Silent Planet, Elwyn Ransom, our main protagonist, becomes associated with the masculine, martial influence of Mars. In Paralandra, Ransom is a martial agent that is brought into relation with the feminine, life-giving influence of Venus. In That Hideous Strength, which takes place on the isolated, disordered planet Earth, the story begins with the word matrimony, thereby giving us this masculine-feminine relationship established between the previous 2 books. However, the particular marriage in view is cold and is disordered because, again, this is a story of Earth rather than of the heavens. In the book, Mark and Jane Studdock are essentially estranged, but through their individual stories, they become reconciled as they become rightly aligned with their heavenly ideals in conjunction with the jovial influence manifested in Ransom. And by the way, I tried removing the passive voice of that sentence, but it's actually really important here because so often in Lewis's stories, and definitely in this one, the point is not so much what the characters are doing, but where they're being pulled, where they're being directed. And of course, that's going to be an ongoing theme, especially of Ransom and the company that's assembled around him, that their job is to wait. Their job is to be faithful. Their job is to receive rather than to do a whole lot. But almost any hint of this fundamental aspect of the story, this Mars-Venus relationship, in conjunction with the ordering force of Jupiter, like any hint of this medieval cosmology or this relationship between the masculine and the feminine, almost any of that is just fundamentally missing from this adaptation. Now, amidst the discordant relationship between Mark and Jane, the book quickly brings us to Mark's academic context. And it's particularly important to note that Mark is a sociologist. If this is mentioned in the adaptation, I'm not sure that it is, but if it is, then it's brief, it's passing, and it's unremarkable. In the book, however, it's mentioned on many occasions in order to drive in the point. For Lewis, sociologist is generally a pejorative term. In particular, he's opposed to sociologically driven philosophy, which is connected to his broader critique of democracy as philosophy. Lewis defends democracy as a pragmatic good for restraining tyranny, but he believes that it's demonic if taken as an accurate representation of what reality is actually like, because reality is hierarchical. Some things are better than other things. Some people live better lives than others. Most significantly, ideals stand above particulars. Sociologists, however, tend to think democratically. They'll say, here's what people believe, or here's how people act. Therefore, here's what we should view as normal. This is the same problem he has with evolutionary philosophy that says, here's what's happening, therefore, here's what should be happening. Thus, when Lewis emphasizes that Mark is a sociologist, he's telling us something significant about his character arc and kind of where he already stands in a certain relation with the forces of Bellbury. Now, I'm not saying that if you are a sociologist, that necessarily means that you're on the side of Bellbury. However, Lewis is making an intentional point here. And also, you might be on the side of Bellbury. Furthermore, Mark the sociologist is obsessed with getting into the inner circle of the progressive element of his college. And if you have any experience with academia, you know what this circle is. As you get further into the story, you really come to understand what this circle is. Riffing off of Dante, this progressive element of modern academia is the outer circle of hell that spirals down into the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, which is led by the likes of Frost and Wither, names that remind us of Dante's frozen inner circle. Thus, Lewis is making a very polemical point here regarding the places of power in modern academia. This entire element of the story is just utterly missing from the audio adaptation. There is not one mention of the progressive element, and it's not difficult to figure out why this may be the case. And by the way, for more on Lewis's critiques of democracy as philosophy, then you can read his essay Equality, or look up Screwtape Proposes a Toast, which is a sequel of sorts to the Screwtape Letters. Next, let's talk about Ransom. In the book, Ransom the Pendragon is this overwhelming figure who represents the priest King Jupiter, whose influence governs the relation between Mars and Venus. When Jane first encounters Ransom, she is unmade in his presence, and as she leaves that meeting, she's enraptured in his heavenly influence, and she becomes awakened to the celestial beauty in which she might participate. By the end of the story, she fully embraces this beauty as she rejects the terrestrial influence of sin in favor of the redemptive grace of God. In the BBC's version, however, Ransom is a rather underwhelming man. Who laments his crippling weakness and occasionally and awkwardly offers to pray for Jane, who remains unconverted until the end. This is not just a matter of leaving out a few things for the sake of time. This is an absolute subversion of Ransom's character and the Christianity that makes him such a profound figure. Now let's briefly discuss the main players at the NICE. First, there's the Deputy Director, John Wither. Lewis describes Wither as having an eerily amicable, somewhat senile, hauntingly otherworldly presence. He's revealed to be downright demonic, to the point that it's not clear if there still is much John Wither present at all. In BBC's version, all hints of the demonic are removed, He's just an ordinary guy who happens to be a smooth-talking leader of a bad organization. Next, there's Fairy Hardcastle. In the book, her primary character is one of unfeminized, disordered sexuality, providing us with another manifestation of the NICE's rejection of the normal. Unsurprisingly, the BBC was unwilling to enter into this territory, and she too was just an ordinary woman who happened to work with some bad people. Lastly, let's consider Professor Augustus Frost, the materialist psychiatrist who understands everything in those terms. Of all the NICE leaders, he likely received the best treatment in the adaptation, although even he was considerably weakened. For example, at the end of his story in the book, he's frozen by his lack of agency that is the inevitable result of his materialism, which is, in turn, a demonic deceit. Something like this happens in the adaptation, but Lewis's philosophical critique is entirely missing. Aside from a couple passing statements made by Ransom, the diabolical nature of the NICE's philosophy is entirely obscured, thereby providing us with an unremarkable group of villainous, mad scientists, which is far removed from the demonic progressives that Lewis gives us in his text. Finally, let's talk about the finale. In the book, the Company of St. Anne's is regularly confused about exactly what they are meant to be doing. And for the most part, they're okay with that, because they trust Ransom, who in turn trusts God and his heavenly court. The one who has the greatest struggle with this arrangement is Andrew McPhee, who is entirely missing from this adaptation. As we approach the end of Lewis's story, it becomes increasingly clear that they are not really meant to do anything apart from remaining faithful. As with Babel of old, it is heaven that will smash the pride of man. Thus the forces of heaven descend upon Merlin with an act that will be his undoing and his redemption. Operating through Merlin, the heavenly powers bring the curse of Babel upon Belbury, and the NICE implodes in its confusion, which is both a curse and a consequence of their stance against the real. In the BBC's version, there is no descent of heaven. Jane, in scorn of her Venusian ideal, takes charge and hops in a car with Merlin to save Mark, while pitiful Ransom laments not having the strength to go with them. Then Merlin, apparently with his own magic, Jedi mind tricks the guards and curses Belbury with confusion. Then they rescue Mark, who never becomes a martial figure, and the story ends. Lewis's story is one of romantic idealism and philosophical critique of the modern tendencies in academia and science to forsake the real, the ideal, and the normal in favor of evolutionary whatever comes next is good philosophy. BBC missed this entirely, or, more likely, they excised it because it would be impossible to include it without the recognition that they are far more aligned with Belbury than they are with St. Anne's.